brothers and sisters in Christ, good evening.
Good evening.
I ask you to open your hearts and your minds as I tell you a story of a remarkable modern-day saint, glorified by the Ukrainian, Russian, and Greek Orthodox Church in 1996. A most remarkable man of which the Western world probably knows very little about, except for probably Greece. He was a scientist, an ophthalmologist, which is an eye surgeon, an author, a general surgeon, a professor of anatomy and surgery, a priest, a bishop, a prisoner, a confessor of the faith. This is St. Luke, the surgeon, the Archbishop of Simferopol and the Crimea, which was Ukraine, who reposed in the Lord in June 11, 1961. I was first acquainted with him when I graduated medical school in 1977, and my parish priest, the mitred Archpriest John Narabecki of blessed memory, gave me this book. It was the first edition. I read a few pages, and then I got very busy as an intern, and I just put it down. Never really explored the book in detail. It was only after I retired 4 years ago that I started to get more interested in St. Luke, because I saw an icon of St. Luke at St. Elias Church in Santa Cruz. So that's the first time, and I asked the priest there, I said, "Is this St. Luke, the physician?" I said, "Yes." So it kind of triggered a whole bunch of events, and then I purchased this book, started reading it this past year, and then we were made more aware of what this physician and surgeon was. He was a remarkable man. He was born Valentin Filoxovich Voino Yasanovsky in 1877 in a small village called Kerch in the Ukraine. Now, the Crimea and Sevastopol is a very small country now. In 2014, you read about the invasion of Russia into the Crimea. Well, if you look at the Crimea, I'll pass this around. It's a peninsula like Monterey down in southern Ukraine, right on the Black Sea, of military strategic importance. And this is where St. Luke, the physician, comes from. I'll pass around his picture, his icon.
Thank you.
So he was born in 1877 in a small little town. His parents were civil servants, very poor. His father worked through the ranks. He studied to be a pharmacist and was able to be a pharmacist for 2 years, and then he died. His family moved to Kiev in 1880s. He admits that he never had any great religious background. He had a background. His father was Catholic, his mother was Orthodox, and never really attended the church. After a while, she became upset by something that happened in the church. So he never had a great religious upbringing. He was a very bright young man. At the time that he had sort of a special feeling, a renewal, so to speak, of his spirit, was when he graduated high school. His principal gave him a Bible. And with that Bible, he would go through month after month, on a daily basis, underlying and trying to understand the Scripture. And from that time, his soul was piqued. Probably the Holy Spirit was leading him to a different calling. He was a very, very gifted person. As a young man, he used to doodle, and he was a great artist. And he used to draw pictures of sketches of pilgrims, of holy men, in black and white, and so that was kind of his first calling. The calling was, and he went then into the Kiev Academy of Arts, where he was there, but it left him unfulfilled. Something was tugging at him, and he wasn't sure what it was, but he knew that he felt that he wanted to serve a greater purpose. And for that purpose, he said he wanted to help the poor and to be of greater service to mankind from that standpoint. And at that one time, he went to a public school that actually he was looking to enroll in, and the public official said that you shouldn't be just a person who's just going to be here just to help, like a social worker. You should go to medical school. So then he enrolled at the University of Kiev, as a medical student at the St. Vladimir's University of Kiev. He was a good student. He was especially attracted to anatomy and had a special gift of drawing. He transferred, so he said, well, I transferred all my gifts from being an artist to an artist in anatomy and surgery. So he graduated in 1903 from Kiev University Medical School, studied medicine. And again, he felt that he wanted to serve the poor and hungry, and he just wanted to be just a village doctor, a simple village doctor. But then what happened was that he saw many people around where he was living suffer from blindness. They suffer from an eye disease called trachoma, which is a disease from a bacteria which attacks the cornea and causes them to become blind. And based on that fact, he said, that attracted him, and he said he wanted to have a greater purpose in serving, and therefore he went to the ophthalmologic clinic in Kiev and got his postgraduate training as an eye surgeon. He was sent to China at the time of the Russia-Japan war, and he was sent there in a hospital. He had excellent results as a general surgeon. In fact, he had such a great, remarkable career as a surgeon that he had the gifts of not only being an eye surgeon, but also becoming an orthopedic surgeon. Back then, you can imagine in the 1910, 1915, that he would actually operate, he would be a brain surgeon, a heart surgeon, a gallbladder, everything. So I could, as a physician myself, I find it hard to believe that somebody would be able to open the skull and become a brain surgeon, to be able to do surgery on the brain or surgery on the heart at that early time when this was unheard of anywhere else. But he was very gifted. He had great results at the time where he was doing the surgery. He married a very lovely lady. Her name was Anna Lanskaya, and she was a very, the patients called her the holy nurse. He met her on the rounds in the hospital, and he felt that there was a special calling. She actually had made a vow to God to be dedicated to him, and actually was going to go into the monastic orders, but then she met Valentine, and at that time was swept off her feet, or vice versa, and they were married. He served first as a rural hospital in Versny Lizbak, and he was the head of the general hospital. At the time, he was also a very intelligent individual that he wrote over 30 articles and books during his career. And this was the first time that he had the first two great articles he worked on. He was working on infections, what we call pyogenic infections, which is where the wound gets infected, and we have all the pus coming from that. And so that type of more of a staph infection. And so he became very interested in this. In the hospital in Pereslavo in 1910, he worked, and he was a very, very studious person. He was a workaholic. He worked 12-hour days. He had very little time, even though his wife left him and he loved his children. He had 4 children. And during that time, he had just dedicated so much time to the hospital that his social life was pretty much non-existent, because he was so dedicated. Civil War at 1917 broke out. The fall of Russia, the Tsars were imprisoned and then executed and murdered. The Civil War moved to Tashkent, where he was the chief of the hospital, chief of surgery, and he was also a professor of anatomy and surgery at the medical school. He worked very hard. At the time, between the stress of bullets flying all over him in Tashkent, his wife became very sick, and she was very stressed out. People suffer from various diseases, but she had contracted tuberculosis, and she died at age 38 with 4 children from tuberculosis. He was very distraught at that time, but he felt that there was a higher calling. He had one of the other surgical nurses, her name was Sophia, who he appointed and asked her to become the surrogate mother for his children. So, despite the fact he never remarried, he had a nurse who was there who was taking care of the children, and it was kind of filling in for the family. He attended Sundays and feast days in the church. In fact, he would lecture and he went through these theological diocesan meetings, and it was the Archpriest Mikhail Andreev who felt that he was very spiritually gifted and felt that he could contribute, his talents to the church by lecturing about different aspects, different topics on the church life and on the scriptures. He was in fact so impressed by the bishop of Tashkent, Innocenti, or Innocent, who said to him, "Doctor, you need to be a priest." And he replied, "Be it as you say, Vladika." So in 1921 he was ordained a priest. He was still a professor of students, and he was so dedicated as a priest that he would wear his cassock with his cross everywhere. And the authorities at that time, because the communists were becoming stronger and stronger, and they mocked him and they told him, "Take off your robe, your rasa." He said, "I will never take off my rasa, my cassock." He said, "I will die and I'll be buried in my rasa." So he was very strong in his traditions as an Orthodox priest. At that time, when Lenin became stronger, the churches were persecuted, they were torn down, and then the communists the secret police generally were trying to root out everyone that had any type of religious background into the point where they were brought before them. They would have these kangaroo courts or these troikas, where they would brought false charges. They would go in one room, they'd have a civil troika. You have 3 civil servants who gave these person, if they didn't like them, trumped up charges, and they said, "Guilty, guilty, guilty," out the door, and they would shoot them. So it was firing squad. He was brought up by charges because he was standing up for one of his colleagues, and because of this, both he and another colleague were brought before the troika, and instead of going to door 1, he went to door 2, and he was released. But this was the first time that that you realized that the system, that the political system was very tainted. The churches were being challenged, were being shut down. Religious artifacts, icons were being smashed, destroyed, and it was a very, very tumultuous time at that time. He was imprisoned in exile. Shortly after that, he was very sick. He was in and out of hospitals. He was tortured beyond belief. At the time there, he would go through the process where the interrogators would interrogate them. They would go 24 hours a day. They would just go through water torture, physical. They would be flogged. They would be beaten. They would be playing mind games with them. And never at one time they wanted him, among other people, to sign documents renouncing their faith and belief in the communist system, and he refused to do that to his dying day. At different times he was imprisoned in exile for 10 years. So in different segments. And so in exile could be meaning, or imprisonment could be meaning put into jail and then released after a few days, or it could be in a larger prison, or it could be exiled to a country or an area in Siberia where they basically would be placed in a place where nobody wanted to be in Siberia, in a gulag, or living in a village. So he was, even though he was arrested and prisoner, after he was on the train to the different sites in Siberia, he was taken off, and he became a prisoner, but an active person as far as working as a profession as a surgeon. He would continually always work as a surgeon, in addition to still being part of the church. He would never give that up. And so that even though he would have church services in houses, in different places, he was elected bishop in 1923 when the bishop of Tashkent, Innocenti, suddenly disappeared. and he was elected bishop in secret. And in Russia, you had to have 3 bishops appoint you. So he had one that had a letter that he knew he could vouch for him as a person, and then 2 other bishops received this letter, and so he was tonsured as and elevated to a bishop in 1923. He was an opponent of what's called the Living Church. The Living Church back in Russia was a church that was a heretical church that was infiltrated by the GPU, which was the GPU was the secret police, the Russian secret police, who were the communists, and they basically infiltrated these churches to water down the religion. They would appoint wardens or heads of the church council. They were drunks, alcoholics, atheists. They did everything they could to control the church.
That's sad.
And so it was kind of a sad part of history. And he always would go to some of the areas where, even when he was released from prison, he would go to different villages. Back then, the Russian people treated their bishops just like the apostles. They would bow down. They would kiss the ground where they would walk. So they're very religious people. He was a very tremendous archpastor. He was very loving, very kind. Yet at the same time, when he was a physician, as a surgeon, he couldn't tolerate anything that was not perfect or very good for the patient. At times, when even if an assistant surgeon dropped a scalpel, he would kick him out of the operating room. Just as a time when he was an archpastor, as a bishop, when he heard that a priest was performing sacraments not in the true Orthodox fashion, for example, he suspended an Orthodox priest who was baptizing somebody, just pouring water over their head in the Catholic tradition. So he suspended him. So he was very true and very strict, but still, I mean, among his colleagues, among the priests in the area, he was very kind and very loving. He was in and out of prison hospitals, and he developed congestive heart failure, fluid building up in his lungs and his legs. In Archangel, he wrote an essay on how to treat abscesses, infections of gunshot wounds, and pyogenic infections, so that he was at the time always doing research, even to the point where he was writing books. And these books and these treatises, the essays of pyogenic infections, are still, for the eye and for the joints, are still used in medical students to this day. They're the gold standard for many textbooks for current surgeons, which is just amazing. So whatever he wrote back in 1930s, 1940s, in fact, he was such a prolific writer that he was given the Order of Stalin in his contribution as a physician and surgeon because of the writings and because he was such a great physician. In fact, even though that he was in exile, he asked if he could help the wounded, in the Red Army soldiers. So he was actually a chief surgeon in the hospital, in one of the military hospitals. Actually, he was appointed the chief surgeon of the Soviet Army. So you can imagine, even though he was an individual who was still an Orthodox priest, a bishop, he still was, he couldn't find any separation between his ecclesiastical, his bishop, royal bull as bishop, and then he couldn't find a difference, couldn't separate that from being a physician, a surgeon. So despite everything that happened to him, 10 years of exile, imprisonment, torture, slander, he was slandered by his colleagues, he was tortured, actually slandered by some of his fellow priests, who said that, in confidence, he said, we didn't want to sign a letter, sign this document saying that you were against the Soviet state, but we had to, we were forced, but we would never say that at your trial. Of course, it never came to trial. So he was, At the time, he was very distraught because he had even some of his colleagues were turning his back on him. But he always kept things forward. He was face forward, always going forward, and always becoming a true Orthodox prelate, bishop. He was elevated to the distinction of being archbishop in 1942, and he continued his preaching, even though at the times when he was actually told to retire by the patriarch, this was meant to actually take him out of the limelight, take him out of the political limelight, and put him, even though he was still exercising his roles as a bishop, being officially retired, the communists left him alone for a while. So he was still a very ardent minister of the church. He had different ministries of Krasnoyarsk, the ministry of Tambov, Russia, and the ministry of the Crimean Sea. His characteristics were really, he was fearless before authorities. So fearless that in his younger years, even though he was a very kind person, he would stand up to authorities. And he said that there was times where he was actually brought before the prosecutors, and at the times when there was a trainload of Russian Red Army soldiers that were brought in that had infections of their wounds, of gunshot wounds. And so there were what the non-physicians saw as worms coming out of their wounds. So they would change the wounds with bandages, and then at that time he had Trump charges saying that he and some other physicians were making these wounds worse by having worms that were there, and they wouldn't clean out the wounds. Well, the real issue was the fact that the English had used the larvae from flies when they were dropped their eggs, and their larvae. The larvae were actually eating the necrotic tissue, the dead tissue, and so they actually found that there was a benefit for having these larvae, and the uneducated Soviet prosecutors thought that that this was just that they were actually harming the soldiers, but he said, no, we're not harming the soldiers. We're actually helping them because these larvae they're not worms. They're there helping to clean the wounds. And so, based on that fact, they couldn't understand that what was going on, and they couldn't believe, that somebody was still helped to defend that. And he said that an attending doctor changed the bandages of some patients and left the rest of the morning. A rumor had spread that the doctors were indifferent and left the soldiers to die. So the worms, when he was actually instructing, the prosecutor said, "What larvae? What do you know? What do you know all these things from?" And the prosecutor was upset, and Father Valentine at that time said, "I hope that the public prosecutor knows that I finished medical school at the University of St. Vladimir in Kiev, and that I am not a graduate of the Soviet School of Nurses." At that time, there was laughter they couldn't suppress the laughter, at that time. The people were cheering for him at that point. And at the time when he was brought before the prosecutors and they were trying to have him renounce his faith, he's saying to the prosecutors, "I cut people to save them. You, Mr. Public Prosecutor, why do you cut off their heads?" And so he was also saying, the prosecutor says, "How is it that you believe in God, priest and surgeon Voyno-Vyashevsky? Have you ever seen your God?" "Truly, I have never seen God, Mr. Public Prosecutor, but I have also operated on the brain, and nevertheless I have not seen an intellect in there, and I have never found a conscience in there." So he was pretty intense, and so he would try to stand up. whenever he was have these charges brought against him, he would also said, "You are," he said, "You are guilty, Mr. Prosecutor. I want to go to higher authorities," and he said, "than you. I want to see the highest authority. If you're going to put me away, I don't want you to put me away. I want your boss to put me away." So he was somebody who was very intelligent. He would stand up for his beliefs, and he was a person who was really steadfast all the time. And at one time in the prison hospital, he said, "I saved the life of a young criminal who was gravely ill. I saw the young prison doctor did not understand the illness at all. I examined him and I said, I diagnosed him to have an abscess of the spleen. I managed to convince the prison doctor to send him to another hospital where I have one of my other students who was a gifted surgeon to operate on him. And sure enough, at the time when he was operated on, the surgeon reported exactly that he had a splenic abscess, and his spleen was removed, and the prisoner survived. The prisoners, when he was in exile, hailed him because he would go in, he would help them, not only give them blankets if he had a blanket, but he would go in as a physician, as a surgeon, would go in and actually heal him to the point to. And so the prisoners, whenever they were there, they would kneel down and they would clap for him because they felt that he was a person who was a true human being, as somebody who was not just a puppet and just not somebody who was just an average person, an average doctor. So he was somebody we would call the doctor's doctor, the physician's doctor. He was somebody who really, over the years, even though he became weaker, he was always defined by his humility. As he was an aging surgeon and a cleric, I'm going to pass on another picture of him. Over the years, this is a picture of Archbishop Luke. And so he was named after Luke, the physician, the apostle. And
this was in 1942 when he was an archbishop.
when he was 1942 when he was a bishop, elected as a bishop.
Archbishop.
Archbishop.
Until then he was.
Actually, he was Bishop Luke. So actually, in 1923, he was his name changed from Father Valentine to Luke, Bishop Luke, 1923. So, as you can see, he was a person who, in my explanation, that was someone who was very humble. He lived in squalid conditions. His robes were patched and they were fragmented. He would give away food. That if he got any type of food, he would give it away to the poor. In fact, he won another prize, an award for his writings, and he gave 3/4 of the way to the children that suffered during the war. So he had a great heart, very humble, and somebody who was really was truly a non-mercenary. He never accepted any payment for anything. That he never charged any patients. So his stipends came from the government. It came from the even though he was living in conditions that were beyond human, he walked around. He had a daily prayer life. He still saw in his latter years. He still had his duties as an archbishop. He still, at that time, would see patients, and up until the latter years, he would still see people in a clinic, and they would still come in. He would never charge them for any money. So at the time from the time he was a physician in 1903 until he died, he was truly a non-mercenary like Cosmas and Damian. So he was a true person who never took anything and never expected anything in return. The Lord had given him so many challenges. At the time, in 1952, his eyesight began to fail. He developed diabetes, and one of his colleagues said that you need to have an eye operation to restore his sight. He said, no. I said, I can't do that because I said I have diabetes, and I said I could get an infection, and therefore the infection would be worse than the original problem. I said, I am happy with the will of God that allowed me to do what I can, but I will not consent for surgery. So he developed glaucoma. He lost his eyesight in 1955. At the time when he was in his last years of life, he last served in 1960, and at the time of the reflections, he said, in 1956, my long journey was difficult. I'll just say it. My long journey was difficult and thorny, but at the same time it was also a remarkable, blessed one. God's grace was with me along the way, and my path was illumined by the light of Christ. And it is a joy for me, a very great joy, to have traveled that path. It was a great act of kindness done by God for me. I considered the difficult years of priesthood, soon followed by my service as a bishop, not as burdensome, but as the most blessed, best, happiest years of my life. He fell asleep in the Lord on June 11th, 1961, at age 84.
June 11, old calendar or new calendar?
Whole calendar. When his grave was opened, there was numerous healings at that time in 1961. Too numerous to talk about. He had also his fame and his saintliness had spread as far as Greece. In fact, there is a Sagmata monastery in Greece that has relics of Saint Luke there also. In 1996, at the time of the funeral, he was concerned about, said, he said, my funeral, I am concerned that nobody will be saying, Holy God, Holy Mighty, Holy Immortal, have mercy on us. And the efforts from the communist government, because back in 1961, it was still the communists that were still ruling at that time. His funeral procession was over 3.5 hours. People were everywhere. No matter what the communist authorities tried to block them, they could not prevent the faithful from venerating his, going to his funeral and venerating him at that time. And at the time, when he opened his relics in 1996, they transferred him to the Holy Trinity Cathedral in Crimea. An aroma of flowers was very, very evident. There were many healings at that time, and he continues to heal. He's one person who was gifted, and a person who we should be looking to for our prayers as far as being an intercessor before the good Lord. And he was glorified in the Ukrainian church in 1995 and the Russian Orthodox Patriarchate in 1996. His troparion is O Herald of the Way of Salvation, Confessor and Archpastor of the Crimean flock, Faithful Keeper of the traditions of the Fathers, Unshakable Pillar and Teacher of Orthodoxy. Pray unceasingly to Christ our Savior to grant salvation and strong faith to Orthodox Christians. O Holy Hierarch Luke, Physician, wise in God.
Amen. If you can give us a few key words, what made this man a saint?
This is what I would like to say. I actually have an interesting thing I kind of wrote down as an afterthought. In conclusion, some of brothers and sisters, you see by my story that bishops were not just born, but come from different occupations, as did Bishop Luke, a gifted surgeon, doctor, pastor, author, and he had the faith and steadfast faith in Christ and a spiritual bringing that came from within, despite having a secular career as a surgeon, never separated him from his ecclesiastical career, calling as a bishop and surgeon, as a bishop. He had a commitment to helping one another, helping the poor, the disenfranchised. He was a true mercenary. He had a giving, loving heart. And the Lord had blessed him with these gifts and to put him through all these trials, to endure everything. And he endured everything with thanksgiving. So at the point where he was really somebody who, despite the fact being kicked and treated maliciously, still found the light of Christ, in his body, in his heart. In fact, when his relics were uncovered, and they noticed that the relics, he was not 100% uncorrupt, but what was uncorrupt and was whole was his heart. They found his heart was undisturbed when they opened his coffin. So he had the love of God, he had the love of Christ, he had a special gift of healing. He was a person who was giving to everyone. He would never say anything. Even though he was very strict, he had a special gift that, even though it was an occupation, he never separated his life as a surgeon from his life as an archbishop. So he had a special gift that comes from, as many bishops and many hierarchs of our church come from different backgrounds. Here's somebody that has an occupation as a physician. There's not too many physicians, although there are scientists through the ages who had a strong faith, but he had a faith that was tempered by the communists and the torture and everything that he was made. He had a heart that could not be broken. At times, you think a surgeon is always operate. There's times when he actually cautioned many of his surgeons not to operate on, because the operation would not give the best results of something that would happen. Sometimes people would heal naturally. When he was in his latter years, people would come to him and ask for a blessing. He would say, "I see that you have it," because he was clairvoyant at the end. And with the clairvoyance, he could see. He said, "I see that you're doing this. Don't do this, this, and this, but do that, that, and that. And praise the Lord, thank God, and you'll be healed." And that's true. So that's one of the many miracles. There's times when there was somebody who was praying for him because he had an infection or some incurable, what the doctors felt was incurable disease. He said, and he came to, and they prayed to him, St. Luke, prayed for my son, to be relieved of this. Pray for him because he was a good person. Help him. And so he came to this person and he said, he told the person in the dream, "Don't go to a physician because the surgeon was not going to help you." And he said, "But I'll take care of it." Sure enough, he went to there, and so he was one of those persons who he was actually in a dream where he actually went into an operating room. They figured they couldn't. He was there as in a spiritual realm, performed an operation, left, and nobody could understand who that was. So there's times when he felt that he could tell people, "Yes, go to this surgeon," or "Don't do this," or "Didn't I tell you that I would take care of this?" So he came, so he would come to a person, heal them, and then leave. So he was. So his. at the time when he was still alive and at the time after his death. He lives in Christ, and he answers our prayers.